The cottage had been in my family for 3 generations. Nestled on a quiet stretch of coastline, it was modest by most standards, just 2 bedrooms with weather-beaten blue siding and a wide porch facing the ocean. What made it special was not its size but its location. From the back steps, it was just 30 paces to where the grass gave way to sand, and another 50 to where gentle waves lapped against the shore. I had inherited it from my grandmother 5 years ago, and it had become my sanctuary after a difficult divorce and career change. Every morning followed the same peaceful routine. I would wake with the sunrise, brew coffee in the old percolator that had been my grandmother's, and take my mug out to the wooden Adirondack chair on the sand. The chair had been positioned perfectly to catch the morning light while providing a view of the entire stretch of beach that belonged to me. Seagulls would dance over the water, diving occasionally for breakfast, while sandpipers ran along the wet sand as waves receded. These quiet moments were sacred to me, the gentle rhythm of the ocean matching my breathing, the salt air clearing my mind. The community itself was small and close-knit, mostly long-term residents who valued privacy and quiet. The homes were spaced generously apart, connected by a single narrow road that wound along the coastline. We had an informal neighborhood association that handled basic maintenance of the shared road and occasional community events, but nothing as formal or restrictive as the HOAs I had heard horror stories about from friends in suburban developments. Most interactions with neighbors were friendly waves from a distance or brief conversations during evening beach walks. I first noticed her on a Tuesday morning in early spring. A woman in crisp linen pants and an expensive-looking blouse standing at what I considered the boundary of my property, writing something on a clipboard. Her sunglasses were pushed up into perfectly styled blonde hair, and she seemed to be taking measurements or notes about the beach. Something about her presence felt intrusive, calculated, as if she were assessing rather than admiring. When she noticed me watching, she smiled and waved, but quickly turned and walked away. The next day, I found footprints crossing my section of beach, not the usual neighbor paths that respectfully stayed near the water's edge, but deliberate paths that meandered through the dunes and close to my home. A small cairn of stones I had built near my favorite sitting spot had been dismantled. My beach chair had been moved several feet from where I had left it. Small changes, but unsettling ones that suggested someone had been examining my property with purpose. She introduced herself the following weekend as I was returning from a morning swim. "You must be the owner of this charming cottage. I am Deborah Whitfield, but everyone calls me Debbie. I just moved into the gray house down the road." Her handshake was firm, her smile practiced. There was something rehearsed about her friendliness that put me on edge immediately. Such a beautiful stretch of beach you have access to here. The water views are simply magnificent. The emphasis she placed on access to, rather than ownership of, should have been my first clear warning. As she asked seemingly casual questions about how long I had owned the property and whether I had updated the deed when I inherited it, a sense of unease grew within me. Her interest felt less like neighborly curiosity and more like assessment. When she mentioned being a real estate agent specializing in waterfront properties, the pieces began to click together. Though I could not yet name the threat, something in her calculating gaze sent a chill through me that contrasted sharply with the warm coastal breeze. The peaceful days of solitude suddenly felt numbered, as if a storm was gathering on the horizon. The confrontation that would change everything happened on a cloudy Thursday afternoon 3 weeks after Deborah, call me Debbie, Whitfield had introduced herself. I was working from home, my laptop open on the porch table, when movement on the beach caught my eye. There she was, clipboard still in hand, leading a well-dressed couple across my section of beach. The man wore loafers entirely impractical for sand, while the woman carried an expensive handbag tucked protectively under her arm. They were clearly not dressed for a casual beach stroll. Deborah gestured broadly toward the water, then pointed back toward my cottage. Her voice carried on the breeze, fragments reaching me, exclusive access, and potential to build something much more substantial. The couple nodded appreciatively, the man making a frame with his hands as if visualizing a structure where my modest cottage stood. My stomach tightened as I realized they were not simply trespassing. They were envisioning a future where my home no longer existed. I set my laptop aside and walked firmly but calmly toward them. The sand was cool beneath my bare feet, a stark contrast to the heat rising in my chest. "Good afternoon," I said, keeping my voice level despite my racing heart. "I am afraid you are on private property. This beach section belongs to my cottage." I gestured back toward my home, trying to appear confident despite my growing unease. Deborah turned, her smile not faltering but somehow sharpening. "Oh, hello. I was just showing the Mitchells this beautiful stretch of coastline. They are interested in property in our community." The emphasis she placed on our community was subtle but clear. She was establishing herself as someone with authority to grant access. "I understand, but this particular section is private property, not community beach. The property line extends to the water." I had always understood this to be true. My grandmother had explained it when I was young, pointing out the boundaries and the responsibility that came with owning waterfront land. Deborah's expression shifted from friendly to professionally sympathetic. "Actually, I believe there may be a misunderstanding about that." She reached into her leather portfolio and withdrew a laminated document. "I have been reviewing the community property maps as part of my work with the neighborhood association, and it appears that the actual property lines end at the vegetation line." She pointed to the scrubby grass where sand met lawn. "Beyond, that is technically community access beachfront." The couple looked uncomfortable, glancing between us. "Perhaps we should continue our tour elsewhere," the woman suggested softly. Deborah nodded pleasantly, assuring them they would return when things were clarified. As they departed, she turned back to me with an expression of rehearsed concern. "I do apologize for the confusion. These old coastal properties often have misunderstandings about boundaries. Check your deed carefully. Many people assume they own to the water, but legal language often specifies otherwise." Her tone was helpful on the surface, but beneath it lay something calculating. "I would be happy to help you review the documentation if you like. Real estate law can be so complex." That night I pulled out the metal file box where I kept important documents. Under the glow of my kitchen table lamp, I spread out the papers related to the cottage: the deed transfer from my grandmother, property tax statements, the original purchase documents from decades ago. The language was indeed frustratingly vague in places. Property with beachfront access, rather than clear boundary descriptions. One section mentioned riparian rights without defining them clearly. Another referenced historical use rights that seemed to support my understanding, but did not explicitly state that the beach was mine. Sleep proved impossible that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw strangers walking across what I had always believed was my private sanctuary. The sound of waves that usually lulled me to sleep now seemed to whisper warnings about the precarious nature of what I had taken for granted. I stared at the ceiling, wondering if my paradise was built on a misunderstanding, if the peace I had found here was as fragile as a sandcastle at high tide. The next morning, I made two important discoveries. First, Deborah Whitfield was not just a real estate agent but one specializing in luxury waterfront developments. Second, she had recently been elected president of our previously informal neighborhood association, which had apparently been formalized into an HOA without my knowledge or participation. The neighborhood email announcing this change had gone to my spam folder, an oversight that now felt devastating. The growing knot in my stomach told me that this was no simple boundary misunderstanding. This was the beginning of something more calculated. Deborah had plans for our quiet community, and my modest cottage with its stretch of pristine beach stood in the way of whatever vision she was selling to potential buyers. The boundary dispute was merely the opening move in what promised to be a complex game, one where I was already several moves behind. The emergency HOA meeting notice appeared in my mailbox just 3 days later, printed on formal letterhead I had never seen before. Shoreline Estates Homeowners Association. The transformation of our casual neighborhood group into something official had happened quietly while I had been focused on my work and solitary beach walks. The meeting was scheduled for Friday evening at the community center, a seldom-used building at the neighborhood entrance that had previously hosted only the annual summer barbecue. The notice stated the purpose clearly: clarification of community beach access rights and shoreline usage regulations. My hands trembled slightly as I read these words, understanding that this was no routine gathering. This was the formal beginning of a battle for my beach. I arrived early, hopping to speak with some neighbors before the meeting began. The parking lot was already filling with cars I recognized, and some I did not. Inside, the usually empty space had been transformed with rows of folding chairs facing a podium. A projector was set up, casting a blank blue light onto a portable screen. Deborah stood at the front of the room, speaking quietly with 4 other residents who I realized must be the newly appointed board members. Their body language suggested deference to her, none making eye contact with arriving homeowners. The meeting began precisely on time, Deborah tapping a gavel that seemed to materialize from nowhere. "Welcome, neighbors, to the first official meeting of the Shoreline Estates HOA," she announced with practiced charm. "As many of you know, I am Deborah Whitfield, your elected president. Tonight, we need to address some important community issues regarding our beautiful shoreline properties." With professional efficiency, she directed our attention to the screen where a property map appeared, showing the entire neighborhood. For too long, there has been confusion about beach access rights in our community. Some homeowners have operated under misconceptions about where private property ends and community access begins. Her gaze swept the room but lingered momentarily on me. The map zoomed in, showing property lines that had been redrawn significantly inland from where many of us had always understood them to be. According to these new boundaries, nearly all of the beach areas would be classified as community property rather than belonging to individual homeowners. The implications were staggering. What many of us had purchased as private beachfront would essentially become public land under HOA control. "These clarifications will protect property values for everyone," Deborah continued smoothly, "and ensure fair access for all residents. The board has prepared a revised set of covenants to formalize these boundaries and establish usage guidelines for the community beach areas." I watched the faces of my neighbors transform as they processed this information. Confusion gave way to understanding, then to shock and anger. Martin Ruiz, who owned the property 3 doors down from mine, stood up without waiting to be recognized. "My family has owned our home for 30 years, he said, his voice tense with controlled anger. "Our deed clearly states that our property extends to the mean high tide line. This map is completely inconsistent with the legal documentation." Deborah's smile remained fixed. "The original development plans filed with the county show these boundaries. Individual deed interpretations may have varied over time, but the HOA has a responsibility to enforce the original intent of the community design." More homeowners began to speak up, many echoing Martin's concerns. It became clear that at least 8 properties along the shoreline were affected by these clarifications. As the meeting devolved into heated arguments, I slipped out to the lobby where refreshments had been set up. There I found Alina Chen, a retired librarian who had lived in the community for decades. "This is not right," she whispered, glancing toward the meeting room. "When this development was first built, the beach parcels were specifically excluded from association control. I remember because my husband was on the original committee that established the neighborhood guidelines." "Do you have any documentation of that?" I asked, a small flame of hope igniting. "I might in our old files, but there would definitely be records at the Historical Society downtown. They archived all the original development materials when the builder donated the community center land." After the meeting, a small group of affected homeowners gathered in the parking lot, comparing notes. We discovered that Deborah had approached each of us separately over the past few weeks, planting seeds of doubt about our property boundaries. The pattern was clear now. She was systematically targeting properties with water frontage, using the newly formed HOA as leverage to redefine our boundaries. The next morning, I visited the Historical Society downtown. The archivist helped me locate the original development documents from 40 years ago. Among yellowed blueprints and faded correspondence, I found what we needed: explicit language stating that beachfront parcels were sold with full riparian rights and were specifically excluded from community association control. This directly contradicted Deborah's claims and the new HOA covenants she was attempting to establish. But the most disturbing discovery came later that day when I searched online listings for properties Deborah was currently selling. Multiple homes in our community were advertised with guaranteed exclusive beach access at premium prices. Access she planned to secure by redefining everyone else's boundaries. One listing even mentioned a pending development deal for luxury beachfront condominiums with private beach club, a commercial venture that would be impossible without controlling the shoreline. What had begun as a personal boundary dispute had evolved into something much larger, a calculated scheme to manipulate property lines throughout our community for financial gain. As I drove home along the coastal road, I realized this was no longer just about protecting my sanctuary. This was about stopping a predatory plan that threatened multiple families and the character of our entire neighborhood. The modest homes with their character and history were simply obstacles to be cleared for Deborah's vision of luxury development. The fight had become much bigger than my stretch of sand. The morning after discovering Deborah's property listings, I called a real estate attorney recommended by Alina. James Patterson had specialized in coastal property disputes for 20 years and agreed to see me that afternoon. His office was small but meticulously organized, with nautical charts and framed survey maps decorating the walls, a good sign of his familiarity with waterfront property issues. "Bring everything you have," he had said on the phone. So I arrived with a thick folder of documents: my deed, tax records, the Historical Society findings, and printed screenshots of Deborah's property listings. I explained the situation while he listened intently, occasionally jotting notes but mostly absorbing the details without interruption. "What you are describing is unfortunately not uncommon in desirable coastal areas," he said when I finished. "Developers and aggressive real estate interests often look for documentation ambiguities they can exploit, but several aspects of your case are promising." He explained that we needed to focus on 3 key areas: the precise language in my deed, historical evidence of how the property boundaries had been understood and maintained over time, and the specific coastal property laws in our state. The most important thing right now is to establish definitively where your property line legally exists. That requires going back to the original surveys and plat maps. The next day found me at the county records office, a vast room with high ceilings and the distinct smell of old paper. Initially, the clerk seemed annoyed by my request to see decades-old property records, but as I explained what was happening in our community, her demeanor changed. "Another HOA land grab?" she asked with a knowing look. "Let me see what we can find." She guided me through the labyrinthine filing system, bringing out large bound volumes and map drawers. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams streaming through tall windows as we carefully examined the documents. After several hours of searching, we found it, the original survey map from when the development was first platted. The map clearly showed the waterfront property lines extending to the mean high tide mark, with specific notations about riparian rights being granted to individual lot owners. "This is definitive," the clerk said, pointing to stamps and signatures on the document. "These boundaries were officially recorded and approved by the county. Any subsequent changes would require a formal amendment process with notification to all affected property owners." Another critical discovery came when we found records of a similar dispute from 15 years ago. A previous attempt to redefine beach access in our community had been firmly rejected by county authorities, who cited the original development plans and individual deed rights. The ruling explicitly stated that the beach parcels were not subject to community association control, exactly what a liener had remembered. Armed with copies of these documents, I expanded my research online, searching for information about Deborah Whitfield's previous real estate activities. What I found was disturbing. In two other coastal communities, similar patterns emerged. She would gain positions of influence in community organizations, then leverage that authority to alter access rights or zoning interpretations, always benefiting her real estate listings or development partners. Most revealing was a business filing I discovered through the state corporation database. Deborah was not just selling properties. She was a partner in Coastal Luxury Developments, LLC, a company actively seeking to build high-end condominiums in our area. Their business prospectus specifically mentioned acquiring beach access rights as a key strategy for their planned development. When I returned to James Patterson's office with these findings, he introduced me to another important legal concept: adverse possession. Even if there were any ambiguity in your deed, which there is not, your family's long-term, open, notorious use of the beach area would establish clear rights under adverse possession principles, he explained. Essentially, if you treat property as yours for a statutory period, which in this state is 10 years and no one objects, you can establish legal ownership. That evening, I began a systematic documentation project. I gathered family photographs showing decades of our use of the beach area, birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings, everyday moments of my grandmother tending her small garden near the dunes. Each image was dated and labeled, creating a visual timeline of our continuous, unchallenged use of the property. I found utility records showing we had installed and maintained lighting along our beach path, further demonstrating our understanding and assertion of ownership. What had begun as an emotional fight was transforming into a methodical legal case. The historical documents proved our rights, the business filings revealed Deborah's true motives, and our long-term use of the property provided additional legal protection. When I finally went to bed that night, the sound of waves no longer felt like a reminder of what I might lose, but rather like applause for the strength of our case. The next morning, James called with one more piece of the puzzle. I found evidence that Deborah Whitfield was involved in a property line dispute in Sandpiper Cove 3 years ago. The case was settled out of court, but I have a contact who confirms she used almost identical tactics, HOA reconfiguration followed by boundary clarifications, that benefited her development partners. What had started as intuitive unease had grown into documented evidence of a pattern. Deborah was not merely confused about boundaries. She was executing a calculated plan she had refined in other communities. But this time, she had chosen the wrong beach to target. This time, someone was fighting back with the weight of history and law on their side. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when I noticed them. 3 bright blue signs hammered into the sand, evenly spaced across what had always been my private beach area. Even from my bedroom window, the bold white lettering was clearly visible. Public beach access, courtesy of Shoreline Estates HOA. The signs had appeared overnight, an escalation I had not anticipated despite all I had learned about Deborah's tactics. I pulled on clothes and rushed outside. The signs were sturdy metal, mounted on thick posts driven deep into the sand. This was no casual marking. These had been installed with determination and proper tools. I tried to pull one free but found it firmly anchored, requiring more force than I could apply with my hands alone. I retrieved a shovel from my garden shed and began digging around the base of the first sign. The physical labor helped channel my growing anger into something productive. The sand was damp from morning dew, making the work slightly easier. After 10 minutes of digging, I was able to loosen the post enough to work it free from the ground. As I was uprooting the second sign, I heard footsteps on the sand behind me. I turned to find Deborah approaching, phone held up at eye level, clearly recording me. She was dressed immaculately despite the early hour, as if she had been waiting for this confrontation. "What do you think you are doing?" she asked, her voice carrying across the beach. "You are vandalizing HOA property. Those signs were installed by order of the board." I continued working the sign loose, focusing on my breathing to maintain control. These signs were placed on my private property without permission. I am simply removing unauthorized items from my land. "This is not your private property," she countered, stepping closer but keeping her phone trained on me. "As we discussed at the meeting, the beach area is community property under HOA management. You are interfering with public access rights." "There is nothing public about this beach section," I said, finally pulling the second sign free. "The original survey map and my deed clearly establish my ownership to the mean high tide line. The HOA has no jurisdiction here." Deborah's professional demeanor slipped momentarily, her expression hardening. "You are being short-sighted and selfish. Community beach access increases property values for everyone. The development potential here could benefit all homeowners." "This is not about development potential. This is about respecting legal property boundaries." I moved toward the third sign, aware that her camera was still recording my every move. "I am calling the police to report vandalism and obstruction of public access," she announced, lowering her phone to dial. "This could have been handled reasonably, but you leave me no choice." Within 30 minutes, a police cruiser pulled into my driveway. 2 officers approached across the beach, looking uncomfortable with the situation. Deborah immediately stepped forward, presenting herself as the HOA president with an authoritative air that suggested she was the wronged official. "Officers, I am glad you are here. This homeowner is removing legally installed public access signs and restricting community beach access in violation of HOA regulations." She handed them copies of what appeared to be the new HOA covenant documents. I remained calm, setting the removed signs carefully on the sand. "Officers, I have documentation proving this is private property according to county records and my deed. These signs were installed on my land without permission during the night. The officers listened to both sides, clearly reluctant to be drawn into a property dispute. This appears to be a civil matter regarding property boundaries, the senior officer finally said. We cannot determine legal ownership on site. If there is a genuine dispute about property lines, that needs to be resolved through proper legal channels. Deborah appeared frustrated by their unwillingness to take action against me. So you are saying she can simply remove these signs without consequences? If this is indeed her property, she has the right to remove unauthorized items, the officer explained. If the HOA believes it has jurisdiction, you need to pursue that through civil court procedures, not by calling police for a property line dispute. After the officers departed, Deborah fixed me with a cold stare. This is not over. The HOA board has already approved daily fines for homeowners who obstruct community beach access. You will be receiving formal notice of violations beginning today. True to her word, that afternoon a certified letter arrived detailing violations of community standards and imposing a $100 daily fine for removal of authorized signage and obstruction of designated public access areas. The letter threatened escalating penalties and possible liens against my property if the violations continued. That night, I installed security cameras overlooking my beach area, a precaution that would prove invaluable. The following morning, I discovered footage of Deborah returning after midnight with a flashlight, carefully locating and moving the small stone markers that had traditionally marked property boundaries between beach lots. She was physically altering the boundary indicators, moving them several feet inland from their original positions. But the most disturbing footage came from the following afternoon. The cameras captured Deborah leading groups of strangers across my beach multiple times throughout the day. These were not casual beachgoers but potential buyers, evident from their clothing and the way Deborah gestured toward my cottage while speaking animatedly about the location. I could see them nodding appreciatively at whatever pitch she was delivering. My sanctuary had become a fishbowl, with daily invasions and constant scrutiny. Even inside my cottage, I felt watched and violated. Sleep became elusive as every sound outside might signal another boundary incursion, another attempt to claim what had been in my family for generations. The daily HOA violation notices continued to arrive, the fines accumulating to amounts that would eventually become financially threatening. After a week of this escalating harassment, I reached a breaking point. The emotional toll was becoming unbearable, the constant vigilance, the daily confrontations, the legal threats. But amid the stress, the security footage had given me something powerful, documented evidence of Deborah's deliberate boundary manipulation. The cameras had captured her moving property markers at night, bringing tour groups onto private property, and even once measuring the distance from my cottage to the water while making notes. Each invasion was now recorded, each trespass documented. What she intended as pressure tactics had instead provided me with the evidence needed to fight back. The escalation had become a double-edged sword, cutting into my peace but simultaneously arming me with proof of her methods. As I watched the latest footage of her leading potential buyers across my beach, pointing toward my home as if it were already gone, I knew the time had come to mount a serious counteroffensive. My property was not just land. It was my heritage, my sanctuary, and my home, and I would not surrender it to someone who saw it only as a commodity to be exploited. My living room had transformed into a command center. Maps, legal documents, and printed photographs covered every surface. The coffee table had disappeared beneath stacks of HOA bylaws and coastal property regulations. My laptop displayed security footage on a continuous loop, documenting each trespass and boundary violation. Around this improvised war room sat my newfound allies, neighbors who had realized they faced the same threat to their properties and way of life. Martin Ruiz brought his expertise as a retired surveyor. Alina Chen contributed her encyclopedic knowledge of community history, and Sarah Jennings, a paralegal from 3 doors down, had valuable insights into the legal process. James Patterson, my attorney, directed our strategy session with the calm efficiency of someone who had fought and won similar battles before. "We need a multi-pronged approach," James explained, uncapping a marker to write on the whiteboard I had purchased specifically for this meeting. Legal action alone would take too long and allow the situation to deteriorate further. We need immediate protective measures combined with a strategic offensive. Our first priority was establishing definitive property boundaries. Martin explained that state law provided specific protections for waterfront property markers. Moving or altering survey monuments is actually a criminal offense, he noted. Those security videos of Ms. Whitfield moving boundary stones at night could have serious legal consequences for her. We commissioned an official survey, scheduled for the following morning. The surveyor would use the original plat maps and deed descriptions to mark the true boundaries, creating an authoritative reference point that would be difficult to challenge. "Make sure your cameras record the entire survey process," James advised. "Documentation is crucial at every step." Alina had been researching HOA regulations and made a critical discovery. The HOA bylaws that Deborah pushed through contain a strict conflict of interest provision. Board members are explicitly prohibited from using their position for personal financial gain or to benefit business associates. She pointed to the relevant section. Her partnership with coastal luxury developments while making decisions about beach access is a textbook violation. Sarah had been digging through public records requests and spread several documents across the table. I found email communications between Deborah and the development company discussing how HOA control of the beach areas would clear obstacles for their planned condominium project. She handed copies to James. The timing aligns perfectly with her campaign for HOA president. Our counteroffensive plan took shape methodically. James drafted a formal cease and desist letter regarding trespassing, with specific references to the security footage evidence. "This establishes that she has been formally notified, which strengthens any future legal action," he explained. Martin designed boundary markers that would comply with state requirements for riparian property lines, substantial posts that would be difficult to move or ignore. "We will place these at the surveyed boundary points, with proper documentation and permits," he said. "Anyone removing or altering them would be committing a documented offense." Sarah worked on drafting a comprehensive report detailing the conflict of interest violations for presentation to the HOA board and county authorities. "Most of the board members are not real estate professionals," she noted. "They may not understand their personal liability for approving actions that violate their fiduciary duty to the community." Alina created a timeline of community development history, clearly showing how the beach parcels had been deliberately excluded from association control. This historical context is crucial for countering Deborah's narrative about original community intent, she explained. As our meeting progressed, a sense of empowerment replaced the helplessness of the previous weeks. What had begun as a defensive scramble had evolved into a coordinated counteroffensive. For the first time since the conflict began, I felt the tide turning in our favor. The professional survey took place at dawn the next day. The surveyor worked methodically, consulting historical documents and using advanced GPS equipment to establish precise boundary points. Each marker placement felt like reclaiming territory, restoring order to what had been deliberately confused. The cameras recorded everything: the professional process, the reference to official documents, the careful placement of each marker according to the original property descriptions. While the legal